In the heart of a bustling city, where skyscrapers pierced the clouds and modern marvels stood as testaments to human ingenuity, there was an air of excitement. The grand opening of one of the most anticipated architectural projects had finally arrived. This wasn't just any building, it was supposed to be a symbol of innovation, luxury, and cutting-edge design. People from all walks of life gathered around its gleaming glass facade, eager to see what lay inside. Among them were architects, engineers, journalists, and curious onlookers, all drawn by the promise of witnessing something extraordinary. Standing tall at the entrance was Richard Langley, the chief architect behind this masterpiece. He was a man who commanded respect, or so he believed. With his sharp suit, confident stride, and a reputation for creating structures that defied convention, Richard was used to being in the spotlight. But beneath his polished exterior lay a streak of arrogance that often rubbed people the wrong way. He thrived on praise but struggled with criticism, especially when it came from those he deemed unworthy of understanding his work. As guests began streaming into the lobby, Richard took center stage, greeting important figures and basking in their admiration. Cameras flashed and reporters scribbled notes as he spoke about the building's unique features, the sleek curves, the open spaces, and the intricate details that made it stand out. It was clear that Richard saw himself not just as an architect, but as an artist, and this building was his magnum opus. Amidst the crowd, however, there was someone who didn't quite fit the mold of the typical attendee. Her name was Emily Carter, a young woman in her late 20s who moved through the space with quiet determination. Unlike most people, Emily navigated using a wheelchair due to cerebral palsy, a condition she had lived with since birth. Despite the challenges posed by her disability, Emily radiated positivity and strength. She had become well known locally for her advocacy work focused on making public spaces more accessible to everyone, regardless of their physical abilities. Emily had heard about the new building weeks before its completion and decided to attend the opening event. She wanted to see firsthand whether this so-called masterpiece lived up to its claims of being innovative and inclusive. Dressed neatly and equipped with a notebook tucked under her arm, she approached the entrance with cautious optimism. What she didn't expect, however, was the frosty reception she would receive. As Emily rolled closer to the doorway, Richard noticed her struggling slightly with the incline of the ramp leading up to the main entrance. His lips curled into a smirk, and instead of offering assistance, he stepped forward with a mocking tone. "Well, well," he said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "Looks like we have a critic already." His laughter rang out, echoing off the high ceilings of the lobby. A few people turned to look, some shifting uncomfortably, while others chuckled nervously along with him. Richard leaned down slightly, pretending to address Emily directly, but clearly intending for his words to carry across the room. "Tell me, miss, do you really think someone like you can appreciate the complexities of this design?" His voice dripped with condescension, implying that her perspective was irrelevant because of her disability. To him, architecture was an intellectual pursuit meant only for those he considered equals, people without limitations. Emily froze for a moment, taken aback by his rudeness. Yet even as embarrassment threatened to creep in, she reminded herself why she was here. This wasn't about Richard or his ego. It was about ensuring that buildings like this served everyone equally. Taking a deep breath, she steadied herself and responded calmly. "Mr. Langley, I may not share your background, but I bring a perspective you might find valuable." Her voice was steady, betraying none of the frustration bubbling beneath the surface. The tension between them was palpable, drawing curious glances from other attendees. Some whispered among themselves, wondering how Emily would handle the situation, while others simply watched silently, intrigued by the unfolding drama. For now, Richard dismissed her comment with another chuckle, waving her off as if she were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. Little did he know, Emily's presence and her insights would soon challenge everything he thought he knew about architecture. With renewed resolve, Emily continued into the building, determined to prove that accessibility wasn't just a checkbox on a list, but a fundamental aspect of good design. As she explored the space further, she couldn't help but notice glaring issues that Richard seemed oblivious to. Narrow doorways, steep inclines, and poorly placed handrails were just a few examples of the barriers she encountered. Each flaw reinforced her belief that true innovation must prioritize inclusivity over aesthetics alone. Meanwhile, Richard carried on with the tour, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface. He prided himself on his ability to impress audiences with technical jargon and flashy visuals, but he failed to realize that his dismissive attitude toward Emily had planted seeds of doubt in the minds of others. Would they side with the celebrated architect, or would they listen to the soft-spoken advocate whose experiences spoke volumes? By the time the group reached the central atrium, a breathtaking space filled with natural light and sweeping staircases, Emily had gathered enough observations to make her case. She knew the next part of the day would require courage, clarity, and conviction. And though Richard still wore his smug grin, the tables were about to turn in ways he could never have imagined. As the guided tour of the building continued, Richard Langley strutted ahead with an air of superiority, pointing out every feature he deemed impressive. His voice boomed through the halls as he explained the intricate details of the design, how the glass walls allowed natural light to flood the interior, how the spiral staircases created a sense of movement, and how the minimalist aesthetic gave the space its elegance. To him, this was more than just architecture. It was artistry, and he expected nothing less than awe from his audience. Emily Carter followed quietly, her wheelchair gliding smoothly over the polished floors. She listened intently, jotting down notes in her small notebook whenever something caught her attention. While others marveled at the building's beauty, Emily saw things differently. Her eyes scanned the environment, not for its visual appeal, but for functionality and inclusivity. Every corner she turned revealed new observations that painted a very different picture of the building, one filled with barriers rather than opportunities. The first stop on the tour was the grand lobby, a vast space adorned with reflective surfaces and towering columns. Richard gestured dramatically toward the centerpiece, a sweeping staircase designed to be both functional and visually striking. "Notice how the stairs curve upward," he said proudly. "It creates a sense of flow, don't you think?" Louis paused, waiting for applause or nods of agreement. Most attendees complied, murmuring their admiration. But Emily wasn't impressed. She leaned forward slightly in her chair, studying the staircase carefully. Then, raising her hand hesitantly, she spoke up. "Mr. Langley?" she began, her voice calm but firm. "That staircase is beautiful, no doubt. But what about those who can't use it? Is there an alternative route for people with mobility challenges?" Richard's smile faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered, brushing off her question with a wave of his hand. "Of course, there's an elevator nearby," he replied dismissively. "We've met all the legal requirements for accessibility." Emily nodded politely, though her expression suggested otherwise. She knew better than anyone that meeting minimum standards wasn't enough. True accessibility went beyond ticking boxes. It meant creating spaces where everyone felt welcome and included. As the group moved on, she made a mental note to revisit the issue later. The next part of the tour took them to a conference room located on the second floor. The room boasted floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the city skyline. Richard stood near the entrance, gesturing toward the expansive glass panels. "This is one of my favorite features," he declared. "The transparency allows natural light to illuminate the entire space, fostering creativity and collaboration." While most of the group nodded appreciatively, Emily noticed something else entirely. She wheeled herself closer to the window and examined the doorframe leading into the room. It was narrow, far too narrow for a standard wheelchair to pass through comfortably. She also observed that the controls for adjusting the blinds were mounted high on the wall, well out of reach. For someone seated in a wheelchair, these oversights might seem minor to some, but to Emily, they represented glaring flaws in the design. Once again, she raised her hand, drawing Richard's attention. This time, however, his patience was wearing thin. "Yes, Miss Carter?" he asked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. What is it now? Emily ignored his rudeness, choosing instead to focus on the matter at hand. I appreciate the effort to bring in natural light, she said, but have you considered how accessible this room really is? For instance, the doorway is too narrow, and the blind controls are placed too high. These issues could prevent people with disabilities from using the space effectively. A murmur rippled through the crowd as attendees exchanged glances. Some looked surprised while others nodded thoughtfully. Richard, on the other hand, appeared visibly irritated. He crossed his arms and forced a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. Miss Carter, I assure you we've done everything. By the book, he insisted. Accessibility guidelines aren't always practical when designing spaces like this. His response only fueled Emily's determination. She decided to push further, knowing that silence wouldn't solve anything. Guidelines are important, she countered gently, but true accessibility requires thinking beyond rules. It's about empathy, understanding the needs of all users, and finding creative ways to meet them. Her words struck a chord with several members of the group. One woman, a journalist covering the event, stepped forward and asked Richard directly, "Have you ever consulted with experts on universal design during the planning stages?" Another man chimed in, "These are valid points, Mr. Langley. Maybe we should consider them moving forward." For the first time since the tour began, Richard found himself on the defensive. His confidence wavered as he realized that Emily's critiques weren't baseless complaints. They were insightful observations rooted in real-world experience. Still unwilling to admit fault, he tried to steer the conversation back to safer territory, emphasizing the building's artistic merits. But the seed of doubt had already been planted in the minds of his audience. As the group proceeded to the final section of the tour, a rooftop garden overlooking the city, Emily took the opportunity to reflect on what she'd seen so far. Each flaw she identified wasn't just a critique of the building itself. It was a reflection of a broader mindset that prioritized aesthetics over inclusivity. She understood that architects like Richard often viewed accessibility as an afterthought, something tacked on to satisfy regulations rather than integrated into the core design process. When they reached the rooftop, Richard couldn't resist, showing off one last feature: a series of reflective pools surrounding the seating area. These pools symbolize tranquility and balance, he explained, gesturing grandly. They're meant to inspire reflection and connection. Emily studied the setup carefully. While the pools were indeed beautiful, she noticed that their placement posed potential hazards for people with visual impairments or mobility challenges. The edges lacked tactile markers, making it difficult for someone with limited vision to navigate safely. Additionally, the pathway leading to the seating area was uneven, which could trip up anyone using crutches or a cane. Unable to stay silent any longer, Emily addressed the group once more. "This rooftop garden has incredible potential," she began, her voice steady and sincere. "But imagine trying to enjoy it if you rely on assistive devices or have sensory sensitivities. Without proper safeguards, features like these pools could become obstacles rather than enhancements." Her comments sparked a lively discussion among the attendees. Some shared personal stories about struggling to access public spaces due to poor design choices. Others praised Emily for highlighting issues they hadn't considered before. Even the skeptical journalist admitted that Emily's perspective added depth to the conversation. Richard, meanwhile, stood silently at the edge of the gathering, his earlier bravado replaced by unease. For the first time in his career, he was confronted with the reality that his work fell short, not because it lacked technical brilliance, but because it failed to serve humanity fully. Though he still struggled to accept criticism gracefully, he couldn't deny the truth in Emily's words. By the end of the tour, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. What started as a showcase of architectural prowess had transformed into a dialogue about inclusivity and empathy. Emily's quiet persistence had challenged not only Richard's assumptions but also those of everyone present. And while the day wasn't over yet, it was clear that her insights would leave a lasting impression, one that would force Richard to reconsider not just this building, but his entire approach to design. As the rooftop garden buzzed with murmurs of agreement and reflection, Emily Carter found herself at the center of attention. Her critiques had struck a nerve, not just with Richard Langley, but with the entire group. People were beginning to see the building through her eyes, noticing flaws they hadn't considered before. Yet despite the growing respect from others, Emily remained humble. She wasn't here to prove anyone wrong or to make a spectacle of herself. She simply wanted to share her perspective, a perspective shaped by years of navigating spaces that weren't designed for her. The journalist who had earlier questioned Richard approached Emily now, microphone in hand. "Miss Carter," he said warmly, "you've raised some fascinating points today. Can you tell us more about your background? What inspired you to focus on accessibility in architecture?" Emily hesitated for a moment, caught off guard by the sudden spotlight. But then she smiled softly, realizing this was an opportunity to explain why her voice mattered. "Growing up," she began, "I faced challenges most people don't even think about. Simple things like opening doors, reaching shelves, or finding ramps instead of stairs. They all felt like obstacles standing between me and the world around me." She paused, glancing down at her wheelchair before continuing. "At first I thought it was my problem, that I needed to adapt because the world wasn't built for someone like me. But as I got older, I realized something important. It's not about me adapting to the world, it's about the world adapting to everyone. That's when I started learning about universal design, a way of creating spaces that work for all kinds of people, regardless of age, ability, or circumstance." Her words resonated deeply with those listening. A middle-aged woman nearby nodded emphatically. "It's true," she chimed in. "Even as we age, many of us will face mobility issues or other limitations. Designing with inclusivity in mind benefits everyone, not just those with disabilities." Encouraged by the supportive response, Emily continued sharing pieces of her journey. She spoke about the countless hours she spent researching architecture and accessibility standards, often late into the night. She described how she reached out to experts in the field, attending workshops and webinars to deepen her understanding. At one point, she even mentioned collaborating with local advocacy groups to push for better policies and public infrastructure. "I didn't do this alone," she admitted humbly. "There are so many incredible people working toward the same goal. Together, we've been able to raise awareness and inspire change. But there's still so much work to be done. Buildings like this," she gestured toward the rooftop garden, "have the potential to lead the way. They could set new standards for what inclusive design looks like. Instead, they often fall short because accessibility is treated as an afterthought." Her passion was infectious, drawing nods and murmurs of agreement from the crowd. Even Richard, who had initially dismissed her, seemed unable to look away. For the first time, he appeared genuinely curious about her story, though his pride kept him silent. To illustrate her point further, Emily shared a personal anecdote. "A few years ago," she recalled, "I visited a museum that claimed to be fully accessible. When I arrived, I discovered that the only elevator was broken, and no one knew when or if it would be fixed. I ended up having to turn back, missing out on an experience I'd looked forward to for weeks. It wasn't just disappointing, it made me feel invisible, like my needs didn't matter." Her voice cracked slightly as she recounted the memory, but she quickly regained her composure. "That's why I care so much about this," she said firmly. "Because every time a building fails to accommodate someone, it sends a message. You don't belong here. And that's not okay. Everyone deserves to feel welcome, valued, and included." The group fell silent, absorbing her words. Some attendees exchanged glances, their expressions reflecting a mix of admiration and guilt. Others scribbled notes, clearly inspired by her insights. One man, an architect himself, stepped forward and thanked Emily for speaking up. "You're absolutely right," he said earnestly. "We get so caught up in making buildings look impressive that we forget their primary purpose, to serve the people who use them. Thank you for reminding us of that." Richard, however, remained quiet, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. While he hadn't said anything yet, it was clear that Emily's words had shaken him. Perhaps it was the realization that his grand vision of architectural brilliance came at the cost of excluding certain individuals. Or maybe it was the weight of knowing that his arrogance had blinded him to perspectives outside his own. Determined to keep the momentum going, Emily turned her focus back to the present. This building has so much potential, she emphasized. With a few thoughtful changes, it could become a model of inclusive design. Imagine a space where everyone feels comfortable and empowered, where no one is left behind. Isn't that what great architecture should strive for? Her question hung in the air, prompting reflection among the attendees. Slowly, the conversation shifted from criticism to collaboration. Ideas began flowing freely as people brainstormed ways to improve the building's accessibility. Someone suggested installing automatic doors throughout the structure. Another proposed lowering light switches and adding tactile indicators near reflective surfaces. Even the journalist offered input, recommending that future projects involve consultants with lived experiences of disability. Throughout the discussion, Emily remained patient and encouraging, guiding the conversation without dominating it. Her calm demeanor and genuine enthusiasm brought out the best in everyone, fostering a sense of unity and purpose. By the time the group returned indoors, the mood had transformed entirely. What had started as a tense showdown between Emily and Richard had evolved into a collaborative effort to reimagine the building's design. For Richard, watching this transformation unfold was both humbling and eye-opening. He had entered the day confident in his abilities, convinced that his vision was flawless. Now he found himself grappling with uncomfortable truths about his approach to architecture. Was he truly serving humanity? Or was he merely chasing accolades? Could he learn from someone he had once mocked? As the tour concluded and guests began dispersing, Richard lingered behind, seemingly lost in thought. Emily noticed him standing near the entrance, staring absently at the ramp she had struggled with earlier. Though she didn't approach him directly, she couldn't help but wonder if this encounter might spark a change, not just in him but in the industry as a whole. By the end of the event, Emily knew she had planted a seed of awareness. Whether or not Richard chose to act on it remained to be seen. But one thing was certain. Her voice had been heard, and it had ignited a conversation that wouldn't easily fade. For Emily, that was enough, for now. The atmosphere in the building shifted dramatically as the guided tour wrapped up and attendees gathered for the final Q&A session. The room buzzed with energy, but it wasn't the same kind of excitement that had filled the space earlier when Richard Langley was basking in praise. Now the mood was reflective, even transformative. People were talking animatedly about Emily Carter's observations, sharing their thoughts on how accessibility could and should be integrated into modern architecture. Emily sat quietly near the front of the room, her notebook resting on her lap. She hadn't expected to be the center of attention, yet here she was, surrounded by a group eager to hear more from her. Her calm demeanor masked the whirlwind of emotions inside her. Pride at having sparked meaningful dialogue, determination to push for change, and a hint of nervousness about what might come next. Despite the weight of the moment, she felt a sense of purpose. This was why she had come, to make people think differently, to challenge the status quo. When the moderator opened the floor for questions, several hands shot up immediately. One attendee asked Richard about his thoughts on universal design principles, while another questioned whether cost constraints ever justified cutting corners on accessibility. Richard stumbled through his responses, clearly unprepared for such pointed inquiries. His usual confidence seemed shaken, replaced by hesitation and defensiveness. Then, Emily raised her hand. The moderator acknowledged her, and she stood slowly, gripping the arms of her wheelchair for balance. Taking a deep breath, she began speaking, not just to answer a question, but to deliver a message she hoped would resonate far beyond this room. "Thank you all for listening," she started, her voice steady and warm. "I want to clarify something. My critiques today aren't meant to attack anyone personally. They're meant to highlight opportunities for growth, for all of us. Architecture is an incredible field because it shapes the way we live, work, and connect with each other. But if we only focus on aesthetics or technical brilliance without considering inclusivity, we miss the point entirely." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "This building has so much potential. Its design is innovative, yes, but innovation isn't just about creating something visually stunning. It's about solving problems, improving lives, and breaking down barriers. When we design spaces that exclude certain groups, we send a message that those groups don't matter. And I know none of you want to do that. Her sincerity struck a chord. Attendees leaned forward, hanging on to every word. Even Richard, who had been avoiding eye contact, glanced up briefly, his expression unreadable. To drive her point home, Emily shared specific examples of accessible design features that could have been incorporated into the building. For instance, she explained, instead of steep ramps, we could use gradual inclines that are easier for wheelchairs, strollers, and walkers. Narrow doorways could have been widened to accommodate everyone comfortably. Reflective surfaces like glass walls could include patterns or textures to help visually impaired individuals navigate safely. She went on to describe how adjustable height counters in communal areas could benefit both standing users and those seated in wheelchairs. Tactile indicators along pathways could guide people with visual impairments, while lighting controls, placed at reachable heights, would ensure no one was left struggling to turn lights on or off. These suggestions weren't radical or groundbreaking. They were practical solutions rooted in empathy and common sense. What's beautiful about these ideas, she added, is that they don't detract from the building's beauty or functionality. In fact, they enhance it. A truly inclusive space isn't just functional, it's welcoming. It tells every visitor, you belong here. The audience erupted into applause, some people rising to their feet. The journalist covering the event scribbled furiously in his notebook, clearly sensing the significance of the moment. Several architects approached Emily afterward, thanking her for opening their eyes to perspectives they hadn't considered before. One woman, visibly moved, admitted she had never thought about how small details like light switch placement could impact someone's experience. Richard, however, remained silent throughout the applause. He stood apart from the crowd, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. His face was a mixture of frustration and contemplation, as though he were wrestling with conflicting emotions. On one hand, he still bristled at being called out publicly. On the other, he couldn't deny the validity of Emily's points, or the admiration she had earned from others. As the session drew to a close, Richard finally stepped forward. His movements were deliberate, almost hesitant. Clearing his throat, he addressed the room. I'd like to say something, he began, his voice quieter than usual. All eyes turned to him, including Emily's. I've spent my career striving for excellence in architecture, he continued, glancing briefly at Emily before looking away. But today I've learned that excellence means more than just creating something impressive. It means creating something meaningful, something that serves everyone equally. Miss Carter, Emily, your insights have challenged me to rethink my approach, and for that I thank you. His words hung in the air, met with a mix of surprise and approval. Some attendees clapped politely, while others exchanged skeptical looks. Was this genuine remorse, or merely an attempt to save face? Only time would tell. Emily, however, chose to take his apology at face value. Smiling gently, she nodded. Thank you, Mr. Langley, she replied. I believe we can achieve great things when we listen to each other and work together. This building may not be perfect, but it's never too late to make improvements. Her response diffused any lingering tension, earning her even more respect from the crowd. As people began filing out of the room, many stopped to shake Emily's hand or express their gratitude. Some promised to incorporate her suggestions into their own projects, vowing to prioritize inclusivity moving forward. Even the journalist lingered, asking Emily for permission to quote her extensively in his article. By the end of the day, Emily felt a profound sense of accomplishment, but also responsibility. She knew this was just the beginning. Changing mindsets wouldn't happen overnight, but today marked a crucial step in the right direction. For Richard, the journey ahead would likely be challenging. Admitting fault wasn't easy, especially for someone as proud as him. Yet his willingness to acknowledge his mistakes gave Emily hope that real change was possible. As she wheeled herself toward the exit, Emily reflected on the events of the day. She had walked into the building expecting resistance and ridicule. Instead, she had found allies, people ready to embrace a new perspective and champion inclusivity alongside her. Though challenges undoubtedly lay ahead, she left with renewed determination to keep advocating for a world where no one was excluded, simply because of how they moved through life. In the days following the grand opening of the building, news of Emily Carter's critique spread like wildfire. What had started as a private exchange between her and Richard Langley quickly became public discourse, thanks in part to the journalist who attended the event. His article, titled "Beyond Beauty: The Case for Inclusive Architecture," highlighted Emily's insights and called attention to the flaws in the building's design. It struck a chord with readers, sparking conversations not only about this particular structure, but about accessibility and architecture as a whole. The article went viral, shared widely across social media platforms, and discussed in forums dedicated to urban planning and design. People praised Emily for her courage and clarity, hailing her as a voice of reason in an industry often criticized for prioritizing aesthetics over functionality. For many, her story was a wake-up call, a reminder that innovation in architecture shouldn't come at the expense of inclusivity. Richard Langley found himself at the center of the storm. Initially defensive, he struggled to reconcile his reputation as a visionary architect with the harsh truths Emily had exposed. At first, he considered brushing off the backlash, chalking it up to misplaced criticism from those who didn't understand his craft. But the more he reflected on the day's events and the genuine admiration Emily had garnered, the harder it became to ignore the lessons she had imparted. One evening, sitting alone in his office, Richard pulled up the journalist's article on his computer. As he read through the comments section, he noticed something surprising. While some people were quick to criticize him, others expressed sympathy, acknowledging how difficult it must be to face such public scrutiny. One comment stood out. "Even the best architects can learn and grow. I hope Mr. Langley takes this opportunity to do just that." That simple statement lingered in Richard's mind long after he turned off his computer. He realized that this moment wasn't just about defending his work. It was about deciding what kind of architect and person he wanted to be. Did he want to cling stubbornly to his old ways, risking irrelevance and alienation? Or could he embrace change, using this experience as a catalyst for growth? Determined to find answers, Richard reached out to Emily the next morning. Sending an email felt daunting. He worried she might reject his attempt to connect. To his relief, she responded promptly, agreeing to meet him at a quiet cafe near the building they had toured together. When they sat down across from each other, there was an awkward silence at first. Richard cleared his throat, searching for the right words. "Emily," he began hesitantly, "I owe you an apology. Not just for my behavior that day, but for failing to see the bigger picture. Your perspective opened my eyes to things I hadn't considered before, and for that, I'm truly grateful." Emily studied him for a moment, her expression thoughtful. Then she smiled softly. "Thank you for saying that," she replied. "It takes strength to admit when you're wrong. And honestly, I don't hold any grudges. My goal has always been to create positive change, not to point fingers." Her graciousness disarmed Richard completely. He confessed that he had spent years equating success with accolades and recognition, rarely pausing to consider whether his designs truly served everyone. "I thought I was building masterpieces," he admitted. "But now I realize that a masterpiece isn't just beautiful, it's meaningful. It should make life better for the people who use it." Emily nodded encouragingly. "Exactly. Architecture is about connection between spaces, communities, and individuals. When we design with empathy, we build bridges instead of barriers." Inspired by her words, Richard proposed an idea. What if they worked together to retrofit the building, incorporating the changes Emily had suggested? Not only would this address its current shortcomings, but it could also serve as a model for future projects. Emily's eyes lit up at the suggestion. "I'd love that," she said. "Collaboration is key to creating spaces that truly work for everyone." Over the weeks that followed, Richard and Emily embarked on a transformative journey. They assembled a team of designers, engineers, and accessibility consultants, ensuring diverse voices were represented in the process. Together, they implemented practical yet impactful modifications. installing adjustable height counters, widening doorways, adding tactile indicators, and reconfiguring ramps to ensure smooth navigation. Each improvement was guided by Emily's first-hand knowledge and universal design principles. The transformation wasn't easy. There were moments of tension and disagreement, especially when budget constraints threatened to limit their progress. But through open communication and mutual respect, Richard and Emily navigated these challenges together. Slowly but surely, the building began to reflect their shared vision, one that balanced beauty with inclusivity. When the renovations were complete, the building reopened with a special ceremony celebrating its renewed purpose. This time, the atmosphere was markedly different. Attendees included not only architects and journalists but also members of disability advocacy groups, local residents and families eager to see the changes for themselves. Richard delivered a heartfelt speech, crediting Emily for inspiring the project and urging others to adopt similar practices in their own work. Emily, too, addressed the crowd, her voice filled with gratitude and determination. This building is proof that when we listen to each other and prioritize inclusivity, we can create spaces that uplift and empower everyone, she said. But our work doesn't end here. We must continue advocating for accessibility in every corner of society, because inclusion isn't just a feature, it's a mindset. The event concluded with a standing ovation, a testament to the impact of their collaboration. For Richard, it marked the beginning of a new chapter in his career. No longer content to chase awards or headlines, he committed himself to designing spaces that celebrated diversity and fostered belonging. He credited Emily not only for teaching him valuable lessons but also for helping him rediscover his passion for architecture. As for Emily, she continued her advocacy work, traveling to conferences, speaking at universities, and consulting on major projects. Her partnership with Richard became a shining example of how unlikely allies could come together to drive meaningful change. Together, they proved that even the most entrenched attitudes could shift when met with patience, perseverance, and a shared commitment to doing better. Years later, the building stood as a symbol of progress, a testament to the power of listening, learning, and evolving. It reminded everyone who entered its doors that true brilliance lies not in perfection, but in the willingness to adapt, improve, and include. And though Richard and Emily eventually moved on to separate projects, their friendship endured, rooted in the belief that architecture, at its core, is about serving humanity. In the end, what started as a clash of egos blossomed into a partnership that changed lives, not just theirs, but countless others who benefited from their efforts. Their story served as a powerful reminder that no matter where we start, the path to greatness begins with humility, empathy, and a desire to build a better world.